Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Yonatan Adler. And today's discussion will be based on his upcoming book titled Between Yahwism and Judaism, Judean Cult and Culture During the Early Hellenistic Period. Last time I had him on, we discussed his book, The Origins of Judaism. And I'll have the link to purchase the book in the description below in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Yonatan, it's good to have you back on the show. It's been a couple years.
Great to be with you, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming back on. Before I get to my questions, could you tell the audience a little bit about your upcoming book and what it tackles differently from your prior one?
Sure. So essentially, we could. I'm sorry about that. Essentially,
No
we can
problem.
think of the new book as something of a prequel to the origins of Judaism. So, in the origins of Judaism, I looked at when we have the earliest evidence for observance of Torah on a wide-scale basis, and the conclusions in that book was that there is no evidence from before the Hasminian period in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. What I do in this book is I look at that period right before the Hasminian period, the early Hellenistic period, to see what was Judean cult and culture like during this period, right before the Hasmoneans come to power, right before we have our earliest evidence of Judaism. And my interest there is to see both cult, so what cultic practices look like as far as we can tell, and what culture. And I look at several features of Judean culture during this period, right before when Judaism begins. So I entitled the book "Between Yahwism and Judaism," and I'm sure we'll get into what I mean by Yahwism, what I mean by Judaism in the discussion, but this is the period of transition, or the period right before the transition to when Judaism first emerges.
So what is the earliest evidence that we have when it comes to, because I think I like to start with we have stories like Ezra, and he brought out a law for the Persian king. When you look at stories like that in the book of Ezra, does the archaeological record indicate a different story, or something that may potentially conflict with what the texts actually say?
So the story that you're referring to in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of a Judean priest coming from Babylonia, Ezra, who was a priest and a scribe. And the story goes that Ezra brings a Torah, the book of the law of Moses, to the Judeans. And for the first time, the Judeans hear about this law of the Torah. They hadn't known about it before, and Ezra is the one that brings it. According to the book of Ezra, in Ezra 7, it was the king of Persia, Artaxerxes, that instructed Ezra to bring this Torah to Judea. And then later on in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah 8, we hear the story of Ezra opening this Torah scroll in front of all of the people of Judah in Jerusalem and reading this Torah. For the first time, the people had discovered that there is something called the Torah of Moses. And according to the story, they discover that they are to celebrate the holiday of Sukkot in the 7th month, and immediately they go set about to do that. And that's the story in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. The question is, are these simply stories, or is there some kind of historical background to this? Scholars usually think, and since the 19th century, scholars have believed that these stories are historical. They happened more or less as is told. And as a result of this belief in these stories, scholars have assumed that, well, we then have Judaism emerging, because if the people are keeping the laws of the Torah already in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, King Artaxerxes, so presumably we're talking about the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era, we should start to talk about Judaism already in the middle of the 5th century BCE. And if you look in standard books about early Judaism, they will tell you that Judaism emerges in the Persian period, the middle of the 5th century BCE. The problem with this way of going about history is that we can't just simply take a biblical story and say, well, it sounds like it could have happened. There's no miracles in it. There's nothing. There's no reason to question these stories. So let's just believe that they happened as they're told. That is, again, the standard way that scholars have been approaching these stories, and of course, that's, you and I both know that this is not the way we do history, and we need to go about attacking this question from a different angle. And the angle that I suggest in my first book that you had held up before, I have a copy here as well, The Origins of Judaism. The way that I go about it in this book is by looking for actual evidence. So what evidence do we have that Judeans are actually keeping the laws of the Torah? And the way I go about it in this book is I take a period of time when we have ample evidence that the Judeans are keeping the laws of the Torah. And that, as it turns out, in the 1st century of the Common Era, we have ample evidence, both historical, textual evidence, and archaeological evidence, material remains, which indicate that Judeans are keeping the laws of the Torah on a wide-scale basis. I then go backwards in time to look at the 1st century before the Common Era, the 2nd century before the Common Era, the 3rd century before the Common Era, and so on and so forth, looking to see when does that trail of evidence end. And as it turns out, the trail of evidence ends in the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. So we're talking about the Hasminian period. Before that, there's simply no evidence that has survived indicating that Judeans are keeping the laws of the Torah. So that is suggestive of something. Why is there no evidence before? Is it possible that before the middle of the 2nd century, before the Common Era, there was wide-scale observance of the Torah, but simply no evidence has survived? Possible. But at a certain point, we have to ask, well, okay, why is it that there is no evidence, positive evidence? And then when we start to look carefully at the Persian period, we see that there's actually some negative evidence, which would suggest that the Judeans were not keeping the laws of the Torah. And those two together, the fact that there's no positive evidence and there is some negative evidence, lead me to suspect that probably the Persian period is not the best period of time to be searching for the beginnings of Judaism. It probably began after that. Now, I'm not the only one to recognize that the Persian period has some evidence for non-observance of the Torah already. From the early 20th century, we have the evidence from Elephantine, which indicates that Judeans there didn't know about the Torah. There's no evidence that they knew about the Torah. There's negative evidence which indicates that they were not keeping the laws of the Torah. They were worshiping several gods. They had a temple outside of Jerusalem, which goes against the Deuteronomy, the notion in Deuteronomy that there should be a central cult. So altogether, the evidence at Elephantine suggests that those Judeans were not keeping Judaism. But then we also have evidence from elsewhere, from Mesopotamia and from Judea itself. We'll talk about this, I'm sure, during our discussion, which seems to indicate that the Judeans were not keeping the laws of the Torah. So, like I said, I'm not the only one to notice this, that in the Persian period we have negative evidence. And this has led scholars, especially in more recent years, to begin to use a different term when speaking about the Persian period. And that term is, if we're not going to call the Judean, I don't like to use the word religion, but for our purposes, we'll speak about Judean religion. If we're not going to call it Judaism, let's think of a different word that we can use. And the word that scholars have come up with is Yahwism. So the idea is that in the Persian period, Judeans had inherited from their Iron Age forebears this worship, the central worship of Yahweh. So the central Judean god was named Yahweh, and so we can call the worship of Yahweh Yahwism, and that we can use that we can use as a term for speaking about Judean religion already in the Iron Age, but also into the Persian period. So that is a term which has become a much more common in recent years. And then what I'm doing here in my book, Between Yahwism and Judaism, is looking at the period right after the Persian period, but right before the Hasminian period. So that period right in between. And the question is, should we be thinking of that early Hellenistic period as more akin to what came before? Do we have continuity from the earlier Persian period, or do we start to see something like we begin to see under the Hasmoneans, where we can start to talk about Judaism? So how should we be thinking about this early Hellenistic period, which falls in between the Persian period and the Hasmonean period? Just to be clear about the dates, so the early Hellenistic period begins with the conquests of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquers the East, specifically the Levant, which is particularly of interest to us, in 332 BCE. And for me, the end of the early Hellenistic period, at least for the purposes of the book, is 175 BCE, with the death of Seleucus the fourth and the rise of Antiochus the fourth, his son. So I'm ending my survey right before the events which lead to the Hasmonean revolt.
Now, some will try to say, well, what about the Septuagint? Because we have the letter of Aristeas, and we know that the Septuagint was 3rd century BCE, or we supposedly know. And the letter of Aristeas is powerful evidence that, well, the Septuagint which was originally just the first 5 books of the Tanakh, the Torah, was translating surely a Hebrew text into Greek in the 3rd century BCE. But what are the potential problems with this story that were provided from the letter of Aristeas?
Right. Good. So that's the story of the letter of Aristeas falls exactly in the 3rd century BCE. So this is the period of interest for me for this book. And if we were to take the story at its word, we have here the translation of the Torah into Greek by a group of 70 odd Judean scholars. And one would think that would suggest that this means that Judaism existed, that people were following the Torah. There must have been a reason why the Torah was translated into Greek. It must have been in order to, and then you could fill in the blanks, the reason why you want to give for why the Torah was translated into Greek. So some people think that the reason the Torah was translated, the reason given in the letter of Aristeas, by the way, is that the king Ptolemy wanted a copy of the Torah for his library in Alexandria, or at least his librarian wanted a copy of the Torah translated into Greek. But scholars have, on the one hand, have rejected this story as fictional. So scholars have long recognized that the story is late, probably dates to the 2nd century BCE, and most scholars reject the story as fictional. But most scholars also, at the same time, accept the dating for the Septuagint. I'm happy that you said supposedly, because I'm somewhat skeptical about the dating of the Septuagint. I don't think we have good evidence, or at least very compelling evidence for the dating. But many scholars think that it was translated around the time that we are told in the letter of Aristeas. So let's say around the middle of the second century, the middle of the 3rd century BCE. But okay, let's imagine that the Septuagint does in fact date to this time period. the middle of the 3rd century, the end of the 3rd century, it doesn't matter so much. The question is, what does this mean for the widespread knowledge and spread of the Torah? I don't think it says very much, because the very fact that the Torah was translated into Greek does not mean that the Torah was necessarily well known. It means that some people knew about it, obviously enough. It was known enough to intellectuals, people who knew how to read and knew how to translate from Hebrew to Greek, that this was done, right? That doesn't say anything about what the ordinary people knew about or cared about, right? So in my scholarship in general, my scholarship is always focused on the ordinary people. I'm interested in what ordinary people were doing, what ordinary people knew about, what ordinary people were thinking, what their practices were. And in looking at what the ordinary people were doing, I don't really care what a small group of intellectuals was interested in, knew about, and what they were spending their time on. So the very fact that the Torah might have been translated in the 3rd century doesn't give us any clues. Even it really says nothing about what ordinary people knew about or cared about. It's very easy to imagine a small group of people, of intellectuals, that knew about this Torah of Moses and cared about it enough that they would have wanted to translate it into Greek. That doesn't say anything about your ordinary people.
What do you make of the story in Josephus about Antiochus III and all who belong to the people are to be governed in accordance with their ancestral laws? And I ask this question in the context of, if the Septuagint, if the dating of the Septuagint is incorrect, how much later could it potentially have been from the standard dating?
Okay, so first of all, it's important to recognize that when let so okay, in terms of Antiochus III, Josephus, our source for the proclamation of Antiochus III comes from Josephus, as you said. We don't have any document from the time of Antiochus III, again dating to around 200 BCE. Let me step back for a second. The Levant, the southern Levant, was occupied by the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE. Come around 200 BCE, the Seleucids, so that's the northern kingdom ruling out of Antioch in Syria, came down and took over the southern Levant from the Ptolemaic kingdom. And according to Josephus, after Antiochus III was the Seleucid king at the time, after Antiochus III took over the southern Levant, he recognized that the Judeans had supported him in his conquest of the southern Levant, and in return, he allowed them to keep, or to continue to keep, their ancestral laws. That's the story that Josephus tells, and Josephus quotes a supposed proclamation of Antiochus III. There's some question among scholars if this document is authentic, if we should believe Josephus that this was an actual document from Antiochus III. Many scholars, perhaps most scholars, think that it is authentic. And okay, I don't know. Let's imagine that this is an authentic document. We still don't have a description of the Torah. The ancestral laws of the Judeans is not a strange thing to encounter. We have ancestral laws of other peoples that also were given. Other peoples that were conquered by Hellenistic rulers were often given the opportunity to continue to keep their ancestral laws. So this is not something unique to the Judeans. And the term ancestral laws, it just means the laws that the people have always kept. All peoples have laws, right? Laws are something that you need to govern society, for society not to fall apart. And so all peoples have ancestral laws. The fact that Josephus refers to the ancestral laws of the Judeans in the year 200 BCE, again, is not necessarily an indication that we're talking about the Torah. And recently, Professor Reinhard Kratz of Göttingen University in Germany published an entire book on these ancestral laws, where he makes essentially this argument that the ancestral laws that we find before the period of the Hasmoneans was not the laws of the Torah.
So now I want to ask you about the administration of Judea. You mentioned, and you bring up over here, the limestone from Marisha, containing an order in Greek from Seleucus, concerning Olympiodorus, and that this seems to indicate that there wasn't a precise Judean high priestly administration, something like that. Could you expand on that?
So this inscription, and there's actually copies that were found elsewhere in Byblos, if I'm not mistaken. What we find here is that the king, the Seleucid king Seleucus IV, instructs Heliodorus, his we can call him perhaps a prime minister, something along those lines, in terms of the temples that are under the jurisdiction of the Seleucids. There's actually no mention of the Judeans in this inscription, but what we find is that in his day, in the day of Seleucus the fourth, the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, the Seleucid kingdom is increasingly taking over the matters of the temples. And from here, we can infer that before the time of Seleucus IV, before this happened, the temples throughout the Seleucid realm, perhaps also in the Ptolemaic realm, were much more independent. And in fact, we find evidence of a certain independence of the temples, or at least the Temple of Jerusalem, in the early Hellenistic period. So, for example, we have, well, already going back to the Persian period, we find in the Elephantine papyrus, one of the Elephantine papyruses, that refers to a Yochanan, the high priest of Jerusalem, and it also refers to the other priests that were under him. And this was from the end of the 5th century BCE. So we have this. We already, learn about the high priest and the priesthood of Jerusalem during the Persian period, at the end of the 5th century BCE. A high priest in Jerusalem continued to exist. This office of high priesthood continued to exist in Jerusalem into the 4th century BCE, and we find that on coins, for example. So if you can scroll up or down, I'm not sure where you are here, where I talk about the high priesthood. There's a coin which mentions the name of the high priest. I think we have to go up the other direction, behind. Mentions the high priest by the name of Yochania. No, if you go up.
Let me see if I can.
Yeah, there's a coin which mentions the name of the high priest at the end of the 4th century BCE. The high priest's name is, there we go, Yochania, the priest. And this is a fascinating coin because on the one hand, it's written in Paleo-Hebrew, Yochania, the priest. Presumably we're talking about a high priest. But the images that we see on this coin are really fascinating. So on the face of the coin, on the left side, we see a face, right? A portrait of some kind, and surrounding the face is a circle. And this has been interpreted as a shield with a gorgon in the center. So this is interpreted as the shield of Athena, the aegis of Athena. And on the other side, we have an owl. And that, of course, is the famous owl of Athena. And right surrounding the owl, on both sides of the owl, are the names is the name and the title of the high priest of Jerusalem, Yochaniah. That's a Yahwistic name, the priest. So this is fascinating. So first of all, this is evidence of a high priest in Jerusalem at the end of the 4th century BCE. The coin has been dated to the pre-Ptolemaic Macedonian period. So this is after the conquests of Alexander the Great, before Ptolemy I takes over as king of Egypt and as the ruler over the southern Levant. And we have here a Judean high priest in Jerusalem minting coins with motifs that are associated, very clearly associated, with the Greek goddess Athena. Now, in the book, what I suggest is that we need to consider the fact that Athena in the East, among the Semitic peoples, was identified as the Semitic goddess Anat. Anat and Athena are essentially one and the same goddess. We find, for example, on Phoenician inscriptions, we have Phoenician inscriptions that have both Phoenician, written in Phoenician script, which speak of the goddess Anat, and on the same inscription we have in Greek a Greek inscription that mentions Athena. So these were known as one and the same goddess, this warrior, virgin warrior goddess that was worshipped throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, in Egypt as well. Now, what's fascinating is that we know that the Judeans were worshiping, revering, recognizing a goddess named Anat Yahweh in Elephantine. So at Elephantine, we have this goddess Anat Yahweh, which presumably means a female goddess associated with Yahoo. So that's the Yahweh, as he was known in Elephantine, Yahoo. And this Anat Yahweh was associated with him, perhaps was his consort. And this is at the end of the 5th century BCE. 1 century later, we have Athena / Anat on coins in Judea. So I don't think that it would be too much of a stretch to argue that the coins which show Anat / Athena on the coins in Judea were more than simply a nod to Athenian coins from Athens, which have the owl of Athena on them. These coins, by the way, are unique. There are no coins in Athens that have the aegis of Athena on one side and an owl on the other side. So this is a uniquely Judean coin, which is certainly at least nodding in some way to recognition of Athena / Anat. I don't want to make too much of it because in the end of the day, what it is a coin. It's hard to interpret. It's hard to know what the beliefs were behind this coin. But at the very least, it's certainly suggestive that Judeans in Judea, living in Jerusalem, under a high priest with a Yahwistic name, were carrying coins that had motifs associated with the goddess Athena. So this is something, at the very least, which doesn't look like Judaism, right? It looks like something else. And that something else looks similar to what we found 1 century before in the Persian period at Elephantine, which again, it's suggestive, and what it is suggestive of is a continuity from the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period. And if we look at this from a longue durée perspective, the Yahwism that we find in the Persian period, this non-exclusive Yahwism, continues to be found as we go into the early Hellenistic period.
So now I would like to shift to the use of names. You mentioned here that names are usually identified as Judean either because they contain a Yahwistic theophoric element, or else because historical sources suggest that the name was used primarily by Judeans. So my question is, so when do we start seeing these theophoric names? And my second part to that question is, when do we start seeing any names attested that resemble anything like Moses or other famous biblical figures?
Okay, so in terms of names with a theophoric element associated with Yahweh, so Yahwistic names, that we already have in the Iron Age. So we have, no small number of inscriptions which give names that have Yahwistic theophoric elements. Um, any name that has Yah or Yahoo at the end, or Yah or Yahoo in the beginning. These are Yahwistic names, and we have no small number already in the Iron Age, which suggests that we already have Yahwism during this time period. Aside from inscriptions that mention the god Yahweh as a name, we also have these Yahwistic names of humans, of people that have these Yahwistic theophoric elements. So this we have already in the Iron Age, from, let's say, the 9th century BCE, and this continues onwards into the 8th century, the 7th century, 6th century, 5th century. I mentioned the 5th century in Elephantine, we continue to have Yahwistic names. Onwards into the 4th century and onwards until today. My name, Yonatan, is a Yahwistic name. So we have straight throughout from the 9th century BCE until the 21st century, Judeans / Jews and Samaritans, by the way, as well, who are giving their children names with Yahwistic theophoric elements. So this is not something new to Judaism. This is a part of Yahwism. Part of Yahwism is recognizing the Judean God through naming of children. So this begins already in the 9th century BC, or at least our earliest evidence for this is in the 9th century BCE. In terms of names of biblical characters, so that's something which actually begins very, very late. Even in antiquity, even into late antiquity, names of biblical heroes like Moses are extraordinarily rare. So there's a book, or a set of books, by Talilan, which collects all names of Jews wherever they're to be found, whether in Judea, in Babylonia, in the Western diaspora, the Eastern diaspora, wherever she found names, both in textual sources, in epigraphic sources, in inscriptions, wherever she found names, she collected them. This is a work of years, ant work, collecting these names. And her conclusions were that these the biblical heroes like Moses and David, and the big names that we find in biblical stories are mostly absent from the Judean onomasticon, from the Judean list of names, which is in itself very interesting. She suggests that it's something. The reason for this could be that these names were considered too special, too important to be given to a mere baby that has just been born. We can think something along the lines of the name Jesus, that at least in English-speaking countries, people don't name their child Jesus. I know in Hispanic countries, Jesus is a common name, but in English-speaking countries, it's not. And the reason is that we don't name our children Jesus. That it's too special of a name for Christians to be naming their children Jesus. Possibly, this is what Taliban suggests. The biblical heroes were also not very commonly given as names.
So I want to go back to Anat for a second. And so, would you say that when you look at the evidence that Anat appears to or could be interpreted as possibly Yahweh's wife, and from the Elephantine papyri, would you say that's kind of like reminiscent of what we see with the Asherah and Yahweh in its Asherah inscription? The only difference is it would appear a different goddess as being identified as his wife as opposed to Anat.
Possibly, your guess here is as good as mine. There's so little to go on. All we have with the Kuntilat Adrud inscription that you're alluding to, um, uh, where we have the name of the Judean god together with Va'asherato and his Asherah. So scholars have been debating since this was discovered. I believe it was in the late 70s, if I'm not mistaken. Um, what does this mean? What is the connection between the Judean god and Asherah? Is this his wife? Perhaps. There's a lot of discussion about that, and about the Elephantine papyrus as well. Anat Yahu, what exactly does that mean? Is Anat the consort of Yahweh? Could we give another interpretation? I don't have anything to add to either of these debates. But what's important for me is that we have at this time, as late as the 5th century BCE at Elephantine, Anat, right? Whether it is the wife of Yahweh or some other connection, the point is we have this Yahwism that is not exclusive of a single Judean god that cannot be worshipped in association with any other gods or goddesses. The fact that we have Anat in a Judean context, and she is being revered. Right, there are monies that are being collected in her name. This is very significant. What I am suggesting in my present book is that this seems to have continued well into the fourth, essentially until the end of the 4th century BCE, into the early Hellenistic period. So this is what's interesting here, that we have this non-exclusive Yahwism continuing from the Persian period into the early Hellenistic period, which is quite a bit later than scholars have normally thought. Scholars usually talk about Judaism emerging in the 5th century BCE, in the Persian period. And here we have non-exclusive, what seems to be, or what can be argued to be, non-exclusivist Yahwism continuing into the early Hellenistic period.
So now I want to ask about this fragment written by Tubius to a Ptolemaic official, mentioning many thanks to the gods. Do we have, besides that document, do we have other documents in which multiple gods are being acknowledged? I remember a while back, not too long ago, you posted on X something about the Passover papyri, in which there was more than one deity
Exactly.
being mentioned.
So exactly. So that what we find in the so-called Passover papyrus, which is dated to the end of the 5th century BCE, we have a mention of Elahaya in Aramaic, which means the gods. We have a Judean that is greeting the addressee with a prayer or a solicitation of the gods in plural. And again, we have a continuation of this into the 3rd century BCE. It seems that this letter comes from a Judean official or a Judean personality, probably living in Transjordan. And again, he opens with a formulaic many thanks to the gods. Now, this piece this data point can, of course, be interpreted as, it could be interpreted away. So it's very easy to apologetically explain that this is just a formulaic expression. It doesn't mean anything. The same, by the way, has been said of the so-called Passover papyrus. It doesn't really mean the gods, or at least the writer didn't intend to show any kind of reverence for a multiplicity of gods. This was simply a formulaic way of opening a letter. And yeah, we can do that. We can do that also, by the way, with the coins, with the images of Athena that we find in the coins that we just discussed. We can do that. We can explain away all of these data points. But I think it's important, first of all, to collect them, to collect all the data points that we have. If we want to try to understand what Judean cult and culture was like in this early Hellenistic period, the first order of business is to collect all the data points that we have. If you then want to explain them away, you can do that. Nobody's going to stop you. But it's important to collect all the data points and then to see what is the picture that's emerging. Now, it's important to say very clearly here that we don't have that many data points. There's a limit to how much data we have from the early Hellenistic period. We do have papyri from Egypt. We do have coins, which I mentioned, from Judea. We have inscriptions here and there on ostraca and various inscriptions, but not that many. And that's why each of these data points is so important, because this is what we have. And what I argue is that the picture that emerges from these relatively few data points is a picture of continuity from the earlier Persian period. So it's, as far as we can tell, the kinds of data that have emerged from the Persian period, which indicates a non-exclusive Yahwism, which is not necessarily centered in Jerusalem, where we have temples elsewhere. We have a temple in Elephantine. We seem to have this kind of non-exclusive, non-centralized Yahwism moving into the early Hellenistic period. The early Hellenistic period does not form a break. The fact that Alexander the Great conquered the East didn't change things as far as Yahwism is concerned. And there seems to be a continuity from the Persian period as we go into the early Hellenistic period.
Do we have different versions of the story of Moses in circulation? Do we have different authors talking about stories different versions of Moses that don't quite line up to the story we're given in the Torah, like with
yeah.
Diodoris?
Okay, so Diodoris dates to the mid-1st century BCE. And although the reason that I discuss him is because Hecataeus of Abdera is said to have spoken about Moses, said to have described something that seems kind of like Judaism. But this supposed quote from Hecataeus, I don't think is a quote at all. What we find essentially, it's a bit complicated, but to try to make it simple, Photius, who was a 9th century CE Byzantine patriarch of Constantinople, cited in his book Bibliotheca from the 9th century a now lost book of Diodoris Siculus from the mid-first century BCE. Okay, and in this citation, we find Diodoris describing the Judeans, and his description sounds like we have Judaism already. He mentions Moses. He mentions Moses establishing uh, Jerusalem as its capital, as the capital of the colony of the Judeans, and his description sounds very much like we have Judaism. The and then at the end of this whole description, so again, I'm reminding you here, this was written in the mid first century BCE. So this is after the Hasmoneans. But then at the end of his description of the Judeans, he writes that this is what Hecataeus had said about the Judeans. Now, scholars often think, oh well, we have here a citation, but this is not a citation. This is simply telling us that Diodoris read some earlier work, which is now lost, of Hecataeus, and amongst his sources, he is citing this earlier work of Hecataeus. By the way, in Photius's writing, it doesn't say Hecataeus of Abdera. It says Hecataeus of Miletus, which is even earlier than Hecataeus of Abdera. But scholars assume that this is just a mistake, and it must be referring to Hecataeus of Abdera, who dates to around 300 BCE. And they also assume that this was an actual quote, right? So the reason why I reject this so-called quote from Hecataeus of Abdera is that Diodoris doesn't no such thing. He doesn't actually quote Hecataeus. He simply tells us that he got his information, which means some of his information, from Hecataeus. So it's very plausible that Diodoris takes his sources from many from many places. It's not just Hecataeus, and what he describes about Judeans, what sounds like Judaism, is in fact Judaism, because he's writing after the Hasminian period. So the reason that I get into all of this is to show that when scholars think that we have Judaism already in the early Hellenistic period because Hecataeus talks about it, I don't think that that's the case. I simply don't think that we can talk about a Hecataeus quotation which describes something like Judaism.
So, in other words, you wouldn't, as you were just saying, you wouldn't put much stock into saying, "Oh, Hecataeus actually mentioned Moses." You would say Hecataeus probably didn't mention a person called Moses.
I have no idea. I mean, we don't have, as far as I can tell, we don't have a quote from Hecataeus, so I have no idea if Hecataeus knew about a Moses figure. Diodoris knew about a Moses figure. I don't know if Hecataeus knew about a Moses figure.
So, in general, what does this data? What would you say the major implications of this data could potentially have on understanding the origins and the development of Judaism?
So again, if we're looking at the early Hellenistic period, what I see is a continuity. I see a continuation of Judean cult and culture. And again, we haven't gotten into all the details. Let me throw in something else about that we know about the cult of the Judeans at this time. So I mentioned that there was a temple in Elephantine in the 5th century BCE. We have some documents from Edfu, which is not far from Elephantine in Egypt, documents which were written by Judeans in Aramaic, which mention priests. And Sylvie Honigman has suggested that if we have priests in Edfu in the 3rd century BCE, the title priest is not just, like the name Kohen or Cohen that people have today. It's not just a name that has no connection to what the person was actually doing. Priest is a profession. And if we find the name uh, or the title priest, kahana in Aramaic, it's an indication that the person was actually occupied as a priest. This was their occupation rather than simply a sign of priestly lineage, like the name Cohen would be today. And if we have a functioning priest at this time, that would indicate that we also have a functioning temple. And again, it's not surprising that there would be a functioning temple in Edfu, a Judean temple to the Judean god in Edfu, just as we had a functioning temple to the Judean god in Elephantine. So the Elephantine temple was functioning in the 5th century BCE. These documents date to the 3rd century BCE. But if indeed she's right, by the way, Gad Barnea also wrote about this, that there was probably a Judean temple in Edfu. He thinks that the Edfu community is descended from the Elephantine community, which certainly could be. They're not so far from one another. But in any event, this would again indicate a continuity of a non-centralized Yahwism that we find in Egypt. The other thing that we can talk about, which you're showing here, is stone plaque from a Judean proseuche. So we have this new institution. We haven't encountered it before from early Hellenistic Egypt. We find several of these plaques which speak about a Judean institution called a proseuche. Proseuche in Greek means prayer, and it seems here to be referring to a place of prayer. And what was this institution, this place of prayer? We don't really know. Presumably, it was a place where Judeans got together to pray. Was this perhaps something like a temple? What was going on in these buildings? Were there sacrifices being offered? Was there incense being offered? Were there perhaps vegetal sacrifices or animal sacrifices? We actually don't know. But there's no indication that these places of prayer looked anything like what we find once Judaism does emerge, which is the synagogue. The synagogue is a place where Judeans got together not to pray, but to read the Torah. So once Judaism does emerge, we need to have an institution where Judeans can be educated in the Torah. Right? That Judaism is centered on the Torah. It's centered on strict observance of a large array of laws. And in order to be able to keep these laws, in order to be able to observe these laws, the Judeans need to know them. And in order to know them, they need to be educated in them. And in order to be educated in them, they needed an institution where this education could take place. And that institution was the synagogue. The synagogue was the place where a community could gather together once a week on the Sabbath, at a time when they weren't working, so they had the time to engage in communal education. And presumably most of the people were illiterate. So, but in a community, you could find at least one person that does know how to read, and a community can also afford to gather the funds to be able to buy a Torah scroll. And on a communal level, you can have education where you would have the one or two people that knew how to read would be able to read from the Torah, explain what was written there, interpret what was written there, and the whole community would be able to enjoy a public form of education in the synagogue. This is the synagogue, which only appears once Judaism appears, so from the Hasminian period and onward. Most of what we know about the synagogue comes from the 1st century CE, but we seem to have archaeological evidence already from the Hasminian period that this synagogue institution did exist. The proseuche is a different kind of institution. The proseuche is not, there's no evidence that the proseuche was an institution for education. There's no indication that Torah reading went on in the Proseuche. This seems to be something more along the lines of a temple where we have some kind of cultic worship going on rather than education. So again, this is another indication of continuity from the Persian period.
So what about the Hasmonean period? Was there still evidence in the archaeology? Is there still evidence in the archaeology in the Hasmonean period of major Hellenistic influence, or in the Hasmonean period are they already attempting to filter it away and start really the transition more towards the Torah?
Okay, so you brought in a new topic here, which is Hellenistic influence, Greek influence, and the way that you posed the question uh, suggest you hid in the question the notion that Hellenistic influence is somehow counter to the Torah, and it's a very common way of seeing things. I don't see things that way. I don't see any contradiction between Greek culture and the Torah per se. Of course, there are elements of Greek culture which are anathema to the Torah. Polytheistic worship is of course forbidden by the Torah. But Greek culture per se, in and of itself, is not in any way, the Torah doesn't legislate anything about Greek culture. What we find, and this is one of the things that I look at in the book, when I look at the degree that Judeans had begun to adopt various elements of Greek culture in the early Hellenistic period. When we look at Judea, Judeans don't seem to be speaking Greek or writing in Greek. That's what we have evidence for. We don't have evidence that Judeans are writing in Greek in the early Hellenistic period. So up until 175 BCE, there are 0 inscriptions that we can clearly associate with Judeans from Judea in Greek. All of the inscriptions that we have are in Aramaic/Hebrew. That includes, by the way, the coins. The coins are in Hebrew. And we don't have that many inscriptions, but the ones that we do have are in Aramaic. So that's interesting. Also, when we look at names in Judea, we don't yet have any names of Judeans that are Greek names in the early Hellenistic period. When we look at Egypt, it's a bit of a more complicated picture. In Egypt, there's a continuation of use of Aramaic, as we had in the Persian period, but we do begin to find the use of Greek in documents from Egypt, from Judean communities in Egypt. And we also begin to find Greek names amongst Judeans in Egypt. So as far as we can tell, there does seem to be a slow adoption of certain aspects of Greek culture in Egypt in the early Hellenistic period, but not in Judea. So that's interesting. When does Greek culture? Oh, and by the way, if we're also looking at material culture in Judea, the adoption of Greek pottery and of Greek architectural elements also doesn't begin in the early Hellenistic period. It's only later that these things begin to be adopted by Judeans. When does Greek culture really come into play in Judea? Only under the Hasmoneans, right? Under the Hasmoneans, we begin to see Greek being used by Judeans. Judeans, of course, are continuing to use Aramaic and Hebrew into the Hasmonean period, but we also begin to find Greek being used, and Greek names begin to be used. Our earliest evidence for this is only from the Hasmonean period and onwards. So the picture that we're seeing here is actually the opposite of what you suggested in your question. Under the Hasmoneans, Greek culture begins to flourish amongst Judeans. And that, by the way, continues onwards from the Hasminian period and onwards into the early Roman period, into the late Roman period. Greek elements of Greek culture become more and more infused amongst the Judeans. What's happening here? How do I understand this? In other words, I'm understanding that Greek culture comes together with Judaism, and that these are not opposing forces. The way that I understand this is that the Hasmoneans, for the first time since the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, for the first time the Judeans are ruled by an independent Judean polity. This is a polity which begins as a republic, let's call it, and then it becomes a kingdom, becomes increasingly more powerful. And this kingdom begins to expand, and to already under John Hyrcanus the first, the Judeans conquer the Idumeans to the south. Afterwards, they conquer the Eturians to the north, the Samaritans, and this small polity of Judea begins to expand throughout the southern Levant, and the Judeans become actually small power, but an actual power in the region. And it's at this time that what had once been a backwater, this small province of the Ptolemaic and then the Seleucid kingdoms, suddenly becomes an independent state, which is a player in the Hellenistic world. And once the Judeans become, like I said, players in the Hellenistic world on the stage of the Hellenistic dynasties, they could no longer be this provincial people that didn't speak Greek and weren't calling their children by Greek names. They needed to become part of the larger world. And the way that they did that was by adopting Greek cultural elements, not in opposition to Judaism, but essentially to strengthen their political power, their political face towards the world, right? So if the fact that the Judeans were now part of the greater Hellenistic world, as Judeans that are keeping the laws of the Torah, so there's no conflict there. Speaking Greek there's nothing in the Torah that says you can't speak Greek. There's nothing in the Torah that says you can't give your children Greek names. So this is what really brought the Judeans out of their shell. Let's put it that way. And I see these things coming together. I really don't see them as a conflict.
And that is why I did ask that question, because I know you don't think that they were in conflict, but that's why I posed the question the way I did anyway. Wayne's World, thank you for your super chat. How many temples were functional in 400 BCE?
Yeah, so I can't answer that question. I don't know. We have the temple at Elephantine, which was destroyed about 10 years before that. There's a question of whether it was rebuilt or not, but circa 400 BCE, Judeans, at least in Elephantine, seem to have had no problem with having a temple aside from the one in Jerusalem. If we want to speak about Yahwists who were not Judeans, we know of a temple on Mount Gerizim. So this was a temple that was built by people living in Samaria. So these are not Judeans, but they are Yahwists. And one of the things that we should consider is that it's possible that Judeans might have visited the temple at Gerizim, and that was not necessarily a problem for them. So there were circa 400 BCE. There was more than one Yahwistic temple. And presumably there were others that we just don't know about.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the words of Ahikar is all about and its connection to the book of Tobit?
Yeah, I don't want to get into that so much because the reason why I speak about it in the book, the question that I ask in the book is what was the literature of the Judeans during the early Hellenistic period? And the reason I mention Achikar is to say that there were clearly other books that were non-biblical, that had nothing, that we don't find in the Hebrew Bible, which were circulating amongst Judeans. We find this at Elephantine in the 5th century BCE. We then later find the Achikar story presented in the book of Tobit, which scholars usually think was written quite a bit later. So these two data points are an indication that Judeans were reading, or at least they knew about stories that were non-biblical. And the question is, again, it's hard to know how widespread this story was, but the fact that we find it out at Elephantine and the fact that we find it quoted or cited in Tobit suggests that there were these other stories floating around. I think it's important. It's illustrative of what kinds of stories might have been circulating amongst Judeans. And again, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because scholars, people, often when they think of Judeans, even as early as the Iron Age, think that the stories that they were telling were the biblical stories. And we should certainly not assume that, right? There's no reason to assume that in early periods before we have Judaism, that the biblical stories were necessarily known and being told. And we also certainly shouldn't assume that there weren't other stories that were known and being told. Achikar happens to be one that we know about, but there were very probably, it's easy to imagine that there were other stories that were being told and that were important to Judeans, which we have simply lost. It's important to remember most of what was going on in antiquity has been lost to us. We simply don't know most of what was going on. We don't know most of the stories that were being told. We don't know most of the rituals that were being practiced, most of the beliefs that people had. The data points, I keep talking about data points because we should be thinking of a panorama of reality from the ancient past, which has simply been lost to us. All that we have left are these little pinpricks of light, these data points that have survived. And when we do have these data points, they're very important, and they can help us imagine what has been lost to us. So the Achikar story is one of these data points, one of these pinpricks of light, which helps us to imagine all the other stories that were being circulated, the literature that was circulated that we have simply lost.
Yurik, thank you for your super chat. Recently, Rabbi Tovia Singer has stated that secular academia has made up the idea that monotheism is a later development in Israel. Thoughts?
So I can't speak specifically to Rabbi Tovia Singer's statement because I didn't hear it. But as for secular academia making up the idea that monotheism is a later development, the question is, what do we mean when we say monotheism developing, right? Monotheism emerging. Are we referring to an idea? And I don't want to get into the technical question of what do we mean by monotheism? Is that I don't want to get too bogged down by the term monotheism. I think we understand what we're talking about. We're talking about a belief in that either there's only a single God that should be worshipped, or there's only a single God that exists. whatever it is that we mean when we use that term. It's important to distinguish between an idea developing and emerging and an idea becoming widespread amongst the people. Usually, when scholars talk about an idea emerging, they're talking about the idea emerging in the head of at least one person. And that we can answer by looking at texts. We can look at, biblical texts, and we can try to date them. And on the basis of the dates that we decide, we can try to figure out where do we begin to see the notion of monotheism. That's a very separate question from the work that I do. I look at not when an idea first emerges. I look at when an idea becomes widespread, when it becomes popular. And in both of my books, both the first one and the one that will be coming out shortly, the conclusion is that there does not seem to be this exclusivist Yahwism emerging before the Hasminian period. That is quite late. And, we have positive evidence that Judeans were worshiping, revering, acknowledging gods aside from a single Judean god. So that's as far as that. There is ample evidence. There is some evidence that there was polytheism. There was a reverence for several gods amongst Judeans, certainly in the Persian period, and as I show in the present book, into the early Hellenistic period.
So when you look at the data in general, would you say that, while not being specific about, okay, this piece of stuff over here is evidence of the Torah dating earlier or later, instead of getting into the game of trying to date the Torah, setting dating it aside, would you say that in general that the evidence doesn't help the case that the Torah could be dated earlier, without taking a specific side as to when it actually dates?
Okay, I like how you worded that question. So yes, my work does not help an early dating. I would say it also doesn't cancel out the possibility of an early dating. What my work shows is that that as far as actual practice, widespread knowledge of and practice of the Torah, there's no evidence until quite late, until the Hasmonean period. What does that say about the date of when the Torah was written down, edited, and so on and so forth? It really doesn't say a lot. It would allow for a late dating, right? Because if the conclusion was different, right? If there was widespread knowledge of and practice of the Torah already, just throwing out already in the year 600 BCE, then clearly the Torah was written and perhaps edited already at this time. We don't have that evidence. To the contrary, it only emerges in the Hasmonean period, which would then allow for a later dating of the Torah. But as you alluded to, I don't do that, and the reason I don't do that is because I simply haven't seen any good evidence for any kind of dating of the Torah. I haven't seen any good evidence either for an early dating or, quite frankly, for a late dating. None of what I've read to date from the oodles and oodles of scholarship that has come out from the 19th century until today, which has argued for various dates of the various Pentateuchal sources. I haven't found any of these particularly convincing. So, I don't have anything to contribute here, and I, quite frankly, don't find any of this very very convincing, and therefore very interesting. The question is an interesting one. I would love to know the answer to it, but I just haven't seen any data which is helpful for answering the question. There's a problem, I would just add, there's a problem in scholarship when scholars have a good question and they really want to know the answer. That's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with having a good question. That's good. And the desire to want an answer is also good. But that shouldn't lead us to coming up with all kinds of hypotheses and arguing for the various hypotheses when we don't have data that can answer these questions. So we need to recognize that a good question and a strong desire to want to answer that question shouldn't lead us to coming up with all kinds of garbage.
Vesper, thank you for your super chat. Which Hasminian era finds support large-scale Torah purity, and what do they reveal about Essene and Mendaean practices?
Okay, so we have lots of finds from the Hasminian period which suggest large-scale Torah. I'm not sure if you wanted to use the term purity or observance, but I can answer both. So we have, for example, coins from the Hasminian period, which clearly lack figural art. Right? So the Hasmonean rulers are not including images of themselves or of animals or any humans on their coins, which is in deference to the second commandment. And in fact, it's not only on the coins, it's on art in general. This begins in the Hasmonean period and continues onward into the early Roman period. We have the emergence of ritual immersion pools getting up to purity. We have the emergence of stone vessels. So Judeans begin to make tableware and storage vessels out of chalk. And the reason they do this is because stone is not mentioned in the Torah amongst the list of various kinds of raw materials that of vessels that can become impure. So, for example, pottery that becomes impure, according to Leviticus 11, has to be broken. A stove, an oven that becomes impure has to be smashed. And then we have other materials, leather, wood, which has to be brought into water. Stone isn't mentioned, and because stone isn't mentioned, Judeans begin to produce vessels made out of stone. It's only Judeans that are doing this, nobody else. And this begins to emerge in the Hasmonean period. Like I said, immersion pools only appear amongst Judeans at Judean sites, and we find, we know over 1,000 of these immersion pools from the Hasmonean period and onward. All of this begins in the Hasmonean period, and we have other finds as well, depictions of the menorah, the seven-branched candelabrum from that we find in the book of Exodus that is supposed to be put into the tabernacle and later the temple. All of these finds begin to emerge in the Hasmonean period.
So now I want to ask you about the problem of using text, even when in the face of the lack of hard data to back it up. And when they look at the Torah and they come up with the documentary hypothesis, they'll come up with a zillion hypothetical documents. And what they're doing is they're building assumptions on top of assumptions about different centuries using hypothetical documents that we don't know exist. And on top of that, not having archaeological evidence to support the preconceived notions about what they think was the origins of Judaism. So my question to you is, what is the problem with that methodology?
Okay, so I don't want to get too far into the woods on critiquing higher criticism of biblical texts. I would say that there are good arguments to be made in this field. I'm not knocking the field of biblical scholarship. there are certainly good arguments to be made for relative dating of texts. So first, before we get to the dating, recognizing that one text is not written at the same time and by the same person as another text. I think that good arguments have been made for such conclusions. In other words, I'll say that I have found many arguments put forward by biblical scholars of this sort to be compelling. So in other words, I can say that this text was not written by the same person at the same time as this text, and I can even say that this text was probably written first, and this text knew about this text. Okay, that these kinds of arguments I think are often compelling. The problem that I see, or the biggest problem that I see, is in terms of the attempt to absolutely date any of these texts. So to say, text A was written in the 8th century and text B was written in the 7th century, well, if you're going to say that, then you have to back that up with some kind of data, and that has to be compelling. And I have yet to see arguments of this sort to be compelling. So if that makes any sense, it's the relative uh, um, relationship between two texts can often be strongly argued. But to say that either of these texts is dates to a specific period of time, I simply haven't found any of these arguments to be convincing. Of course, if we have a text that mentions Artaxerxes, that text was written at the time of Artaxerxes or later. There's a text that mentions Cyrus, that text was written at the time of Cyrus or later. But in order to say how much later, you're going to need to bring data to support your argument. And a text that lacks any reference to any historical event, and therefore I can't say that it must have occurred after that event, you're going to have to bring some kind of data to support your dating. You can't just say, throw out a year, 8th century, 7th century, 6th century, and expect us to accept that. I also don't accept arguments for a text sounding archaic, and therefore it must date to, and then you throw out a century. We can't work that way. We can't just throw out years and expect scholars to accept them because I don't know what. So those kinds of arguments I don't find compelling at all.
By which point do we absolutely know that, okay, but by this certain period, Yahweh's being worshipped as practically the only God or something close to that effect, and they've gotten rid of polytheism. By which point do we know that's actually happened?
Okay, so there are going to be scholars that are going to disagree with what I'm going to say here because they're going to say that that's never happened, that until today, there's no such thing as monotheism. And within Judaism, they'll say you have, angels, and you have when we get to the Zohar and Kabbalah, we have all kinds of the Sfirot and all kinds of celestial beings together with Yahweh. Putting all of that aside, in terms of the kinds of things that we find in earlier periods, where we find what you mentioned, Yahweh and V'Asherato, where we find Anat Yahweh and Cherem Bethel, and so on and so forth, other gods, other deities, alongside Yahweh. That we don't find in the Hasminian period and onward. We don't find multiple deities that are being worshipped by the Judeans. I'm sure scholars will be able to come up with, random mentions of beings that they would, I guess, possibly think of as something, within the realm of the Judean God, but actual polytheism, actual uh, worship of or reverence for real deities, real gods, alongside Yahweh. I would say from the Hasminian period, we don't see that. By the way, the reason that we don't see it from the Hasmonean period is because it says in the Torah that you're not supposed to do that. So that's something which it says very clearly in the Torah that you're not supposed to worship gods alongside Yahweh. So from the period that the Torah becomes widespread, the Torah becomes the law of the land. That's when this disappears. I think that's the reason that that makes sense.
So when you look at just to circle back to Ezra, so when you look at stories of Ezra bringing out some kind of law code at the request of at the order of Artaxerxes, are they? Do you see these stories as potentially attempting to backdate the Torah, creating a trail to lead back to Moses through Ezra, Hilkiah, and others, like in the letter of Aristeas? Do you, do you think Do you think these are different attempts to like create a trail leading back to Moses in the Mosaic attribution?
Um, Perhaps something along those lines. I think that there were people who had this notion of a Mosaic Torah, going back, some time, and they told stories about Judeans, first learning about the Torah, the Torah suddenly coming upon the stage. Judeans not knowing about this thing, and then wow, okay, we just discovered this. Okay, we really should keep it. So we have that with Josiah, the story of Josiah. We have it with the story of Ezra, and it's interesting that it's a similar kind of story, right? It's a similar story where the Danes completely knew nothing about the Torah, and then what? Somebody discovered this Torah, reads it before the people. We need to keep it. Um, Again, the fact that the story is told doesn't mean that it happened, but the people that are writing this story wanted their readers to read this story. So this was an important story for them to tell. Why did they want to tell this story? I think because they wanted to convince their readers that the Torah is something that they should be keeping. And despite the fact that it's not well known, or it hadn't been well known, you need to recognize its authority, and you need to be keeping this Torah. I don't know when these stories were written. I don't know when the Josiah story was written. I don't know when the Ezra story was written. But regardless, its authors wanted the Judeans to be keeping the laws of the Torah. Uh, that doesn't mean that they were keeping the laws of the Torah, but they wanted them to. So I think I think the answer to your question is yes. This is what they wanted. This is what they were trying to do. They were trying to call for widespread observance of the Torah. That's what they were up to.
So now I want to bring up the Greek style architecture in this photo that you have here. And you mentioned now you have Eastern style lion sculpture early to mid second century BCE. And does this style of architecture continue into the first century BCE as well?
So I won't speak about the mixed style, but in terms of Greek style architecture, absolutely. So this is the early, or one of the earliest uh, evidence we have for the use of Greek style architecture. And when I speak of Greek style architecture, I'm thinking of the famous Greek orders, the Doric, the Ionian, and the Corinthian. which we have in the Greek world centuries before this, but amongst Judeans it only appears from the 2nd century BCE and onwards. And to your question, does it continue onward? The answer is yes. The temple in Jerusalem that Josephus describes, and the rabbis, by the way, is a Greco-Roman temple, right? It's, Josephus describes the royal stoa as being of the Corinthian order, and the stoa itself is a Roman structure. So this Greco-Roman architecture continues amongst Judeans in the Jerusalem temple itself. And again, the point here is that Greek culture, Greek architecture that we're talking about, is not in any way is not in conflict in any way with Judaism. You can build the Judean temple as a Greco-Roman temple. That's not a problem. It's no contradiction to the Torah as long as the God that's being worshipped there is the Judean God who's being worshipped according to the laws of the Torah, according to the laws that we find in Leviticus. So as long as we're following the laws of the Torah, the architecture, the language, the names, all of these things are in no way a problem. I would go further. We find Judaism adopting all kinds of Greco-Roman cultural artifacts, like, for example, the symposium, which is used as the model for what becomes the Passover meal. Right? So the Passover meal, the way the rabbis describe it, is essentially a Greco-Roman symposium. So, and we find this with a lot of aspects. The synagogue itself that I described, this educational institution, I think to a certain degree is modeled on the gymnasium, right? We don't have an educational institution of any sort amongst the Judeans prior to this time. The Judeans took this notion of public education and adopted it for their own use for the promulgation of the Torah as the synagogue. This is essentially, I think a good argument could be made, this is essentially a Greek institution. But again, there's no reason to think that would have been a problem.
We have a super chat question from Esmil. Thank you for your super chat. Is there any link between the writing of the Torah around the Hasmonian period and the finding of the book of the law in 2 Kings 22?
So to be clear, I am not arguing that the Torah was written around the Hasmonian period. I'm arguing that the Torah was adopted as the law of the land it seems to be under the Hasmoneans, and the stories that we find in Kings and in Chronicles as well about the discovery of the law. Again, I'm not arguing that this was written in the Hasmonean period either. These were stories that I think under the Hasmoneans probably became well known, and probably served the Hasmoneans' purposes by, again, having this notion of, okay, the Torah could be something which wasn't well known. It existed, it wasn't well known, and now it becomes well known under the aegis of a king. So there's something similar here. I think this certainly served the purposes of the Hasmoneans, if indeed my hypothesis is correct, that it was the Hasmoneans that adopted the Torah. This story would have served their purposes quite well, and also the story of Ezra, which again, as I said, is a similar story.
And for my final question, what are the problems with over reliant on the text that could potentially lead to overreading without really considering the archaeological data and how that can conflict with texts?
So what I think is great about archaeology is that that when archaeological data is randomly sampled, when we find you know at sites throughout the country, we have when we excavate a site, we don't excavate the entire site, right? We excavate a small portion of the site. We can excavate an area here, an area there. We're essentially randomly sampling from a site, and we don't find everything that was there. We find what happens to have survived and what we happen to have excavated. Right? If I excavate, um, 2 meters down and not 3 meters down, I'm only going to find what I've excavated, and I'm only going to find the things that are made of usually non-organic material that will survive. So it's very random what happens to survive. That randomness, I think, is good for giving us a window onto ordinary life. This is not something that was left over on purpose for me, the archaeologist, to find. Uh, that is good if we want to get a window onto what ordinary people are doing. That's archaeology. Texts were written for the express purpose of passing on information, of communicating information to the readers. And texts, by definition, are written by literate people. And literate people were, and we're not talking about only literate people, we're talking about literate people that were capable of writing texts of a high caliber. By definition, these people are a minority of the population. These are not, your ordinary farmers. These are not your ordinary, ordinary housewife that we would find in a marketplace in antiquity. So the archaeology gives us a window onto 99.999% of the population. Texts give us a window onto a very, very small portion of the population, and a very specific uh, 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 layer of that very small portion of the population. Now, the good thing about texts is that as an historian, there's a lot of data there, right? There's words, there's thoughts, there's so much in there. But the problem is when we take those texts and say to ourselves, well, this is what we have, so we'll just use this as a window onto what everyone was doing. Now, I want to be clear. It's not that the texts cannot be used for understanding what ordinary people were doing. They can. Um, you know, any text that we have from a certain point in the past, the author was living in that period, right? The author was living in the period that within which he lived and wrote, obviously. So tautology. But he was a part of that society. So, he was wearing the clothing that other people was wearing. He was, using the modes of transportation that other people were using. He was speaking the language that other people were using. He was a part of that society. Usually, these ancient texts don't describe the ordinary people, but at least in between the lines, we can try to derive data about them. But in terms of of who wrote these texts, like I said, they're written by the creme de la creme of any society, and therefore they were written for a purpose. So these are all texts that have some kind of ideological slash religious slash political purpose for which they were written. A good historian knows how to look for that and to try to, like I said, read between the lines to try to get beyond that. But we always have to remember that that's what the texts are. And I've never argued that we should only use one or the other. We should only use archaeology or texts. To the contrary, texts give us one window onto ancient reality. Archaeology gives us another window, and what we're best advised to use all of the windows that we have. We're never going to have a panoramic view of the past. We're always only going to have these small apertures onto what was, and we're best advised to take all of these apertures, take all of these windows onto the past, and look through them and try to get as whole of a picture as we can get. We'll never have a whole picture, but as best we can, we should look at all of the data that we have, understand what that data is, and use that to try to piece together a picture.
So before we close, can you tell the audience when is your book coming out, and where can they go to purchase it?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I am hoping it will be within the next week or two. And when it does come out, it will, as far as I understand it, it's going to be coming out, by the way, with Cambridge University Press. As far as I understand, it will be coming out online at first. And from what I understand, it will be freely available for the first 2 weeks. So I will be posting about it on my X account, on my Facebook account. You can go to my academia.edu account. And if you're able to post it in the description of the video as well, when it does come out, I will be putting a link onto that on all of these sites. So follow me on all the sites. You'll get updates about the book and about my work in general.
In the meantime, if y'all want to, you can get a copy of The Origins of Judaism. The link to it will be in the description below in the pinned comment. And when Yonatan's latest book becomes available, the link will be added in the description below and in the pinned comment as well. That being said, Yonatan, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Jacob. It was a pleasure, as always.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.